So this is stages from Mutable instruments. And before we get into the features of this segment generator, let's take a look at some of the patches to come in the video. Now you've just seen sequencing, 2-stage envelopes, 4-stage, 5, 6-stage envelopes, sustained functions dependent on gate length, triggered functions, audio pass-through, CV pass-through, influencing envelopes with CV shapes, creating groups, and all sorts of various things that stages can do. Now, much like a, say, surge dual slope generator, I love the fact that stages is all about how it's patched. There's no menu, there's just a couple of buttons to have a green, orange or red mode and whether that's looping or not. And that's it. It's how we patch this modulation building block that depends on how it works. So to state the manual, stages is a construction set for building modulation signals capable of generating complex multi-stage envelopes, step sequences or several channels of LFOs. We can start with a 6-segment envelope and break it down into smaller independent envelopes down to the smallest atom of modulation, which is a D envelope, just a falling decay envelope on a single segment. At this stage, I'll say that you can actually link modules to create more stages, be it 2 modules to create 12 or 3 to create 18, and you could have a 10-part sequence and 2 ADSRs. You can chain stages with multiple modules. I only have one here, but that's demonstrated very simply, plugging them in around the back in the manual. Now the first and I would say most important thing is to look at how grouping works on stages. Whether that behaves like 6 independent decay envelopes or a 6-segment envelope generator or anything in between is dependent on which gate inputs are patched. Now we start from right to left because any gate signal will dictate the start of a group. If I was to patch into segment 5, this would group gates 5 and 6. So if I go into a manual gate module and press a gate, we can see we're getting like an AD style response. If I go to stage 3 and add something like a sustain or a hold in between, we can create more stages. So we patch from right to left. Everything to the right of the gate input is part of that group. We could have single function, 2 segments, 3, 4, or anything up to 6. Now there are 3 modes of operation on stages. The green mode, which is a ramp, and this segment smoothly ramps from one value to another. Its time is controlled by the slider and its CV input. And the shape of that ramp, be it rising or falling, goes from logarithmic to linear at 12 o'clock through to exponential on these potentiometers at the top. Now the orange mode is like a step in a sequence. but this segment will glide to the target voltage from the current value. So we set our values and set a glide time on the potentiometers. The red mode plateaus at a set voltage for a controllable duration, and the duration is set by the top knobs, and the value is set by the sliders. To make a segment loop on itself, we hold this button. Let's do that for all of them. If these are looping ramps, these are all LFOs with their time controlled by the sliders and the shape controlled by the pots up top. Now we can patch up ADSRs with an adjustable pre-delay, hold sections, sustain sections, trapezoid generators, sequences that will glide, sequential switching. There's a whole range of things you can do with this very simple segment generator. Now, because this is all in the patching and stages can do so much, there's an index in the video description allowing you to skip through and see what happens at what times. If you want to patch up 3 AD envelopes, or an ADSR generator, or an attack, hold, decay, sustain, release, or a sequential switch, you can find that in the video description, click on the timing and skip through and find out exactly what you want. I advise watching this in one sitting if possible, or at least in full. Get as much as you can from it and then go back and check out those various patches as you need to. So let's start by creating AD envelopes, just 2 segments to create 2 stage envelopes, a rise and a fall like a function generator or an attack and decay. We should patch from right to left so that we can chain these gates across to each other as I explained earlier in the video. So I'm going to patch my gate into the 5th segment. This will now create a 2-stage envelope. If we patch that out into my VCA that has some cymbal-like noise in it, we have an attack and a decay. That's this yellow trace on the MODAX data. So attack time, and the shape of the attack at the top, from logarithmic through linear to these little exponential rises, which is like a tight little whip. Then got the decay time or the fall time. Again, exponential through linear to a logarithmic kind of hump. Now, if we want to create more AD envelopes, we just patch a gate into 3 to chain 3 and 4, and a gate into 1 to chain 1 and 2. So let's patch a more rhythmic pattern into 3 and 4, and take this output. This is a sound panned hard right, so please make sure you're listening in stereo. And that's this blue trace on data. And finally, let's patch in a 3rd rhythmic source to the 1st channel. And again, patch out to a VCA. This is panned hard left. So just to mute my sounds, we have this channel 5 and 6, cymbal noise, 3 and 4, sound panned hard right, and 1 and 2, panned hard left. So with their times controlled, by the sliders, shape controlled by the pots at the top. Let's try some feedback patching. The most sparse pattern is this middle one, and even though we're getting our output from 1, which is chaining 1 and 2, output from 3, chaining 3 and 4, output from 5, chaining 5 and 6. 6, 4 and 2 do have their own outputs. That's just a single segment output. Now let's patch this decay out into the rise time or attack of this first envelope. This is going to give a kind of sidechain-like sound because when this sound is struck, it's going to push that attack time up out of the way. So I'm going to mute this third channel on my mixer. And we can see that shape and that interaction. You can hear that in stereo as well. Could also do that with the cymbal. Maybe it's decay time, or it's rise time. And let's just patch one more. So we're getting a lot of interaction by just a little bit of basic feedback patching. So in this patch, let's take a look at patching up ADSRs, a standard 4-stage attack, decay, sustain, release, subtractive East Coast style envelope. Now ADSRs are gated. They have a sustain period that holds as long as the gate holds after attacking, decaying to the sustain level, and then releasing. So I'm going to patch in an LED cable, and again, working from right to left, I want release, sustain, decay, attack. And I'm using an LED cable so you can see on that light there how long this gate is held for. I'm going to patch my output into the data scope. And this is controlling the level of plats. Simple patch. Now we've got the ramp segments for the attack decay. We then need a sustain. But in order to get this to sustain with the gate, we hold till we get a flashing red, and then this will hold as long as the gate is held. So if I add some sustain level, let's just say full, we can see that's as high. And this stage is as high as long as the input gate. So you're watching the LED cable for the gate. So we've then got our attack time and our shape controls. Because this will only hold when the gate is high, we can go straight to a release with a gate that is too short, as you would on a standard ADSR, or it will hold. If we lower the sustain, let's add some decay. Now we can turn this into a triggered ADSR. So really that sustain stage is then a hold, an attack, decay, a hold, and a release, which won't take into account the gate length at all. And holding the button to go back to a standard, just always on red LED, this now isn't going to take into account the gate length on this sustain period. Instead, this will still be the sustain level, but the time is set by the top knob. Now I'm just triggering this with a very tiny gate, but if I hold it, notice it has no effect. So holding the button to get flashing red, we can have a gate dependent sustain, a standard attack, decay, sustain, release, which responds to gate time. Holding it to go back, we then set the sustain or the hold period time with the top potentiometer. Now the same patch setup that we've just had for ADSR envelopes or ADHR envelopes, whether we're gating or triggering them, let's expand this from a 4-stage envelope to a 5-stage envelope. Now we're going to add a hold stage between the attack and decay. So we get an attack, a hold, decay, sustain, release, I've slightly expanded the patch by patching the output of plats into a filter. So instead of just modulating the level of plats, we're also modulating the cutoff with the output of stages. And with this as an ADSR, just as it was, here's how that sounds. So I want 5 stages. So going left to right, I'm going to have to go over to segment 2, out of segment 2. And going back to our green as a kind of base point on an attack and then a hold. So I'm going to make this red, a decay, and then a sustain. So again, I want this to hold this voltage, but I want this to be gate dependent. So we'll have an attack, a hold, a decay, a sustain, and a release. Just going to make this loop as well. Let's add some attack. And notice that while I'm getting this set up, it will kind of correct what I'm doing, because I couldn't have a gate dependent hold stage and a gate dependent sustain, because when that would end, and it would make these in between segments irrelevant. So a non-looping red would be my hold, decay, sustain, release. So notice attack, hold at the top, decay, sustain, and then a release. It's gate dependent because we can still skip straight through. Now another 5-stage envelope we could create would be a delayed ADSR. So again, let's just kind of reset, because I like this visually to be a kind of base point. We still want 5 stages, but we want this attack, decay, sustain, release, but we want a delay at the start. So that will add a delay, a timing offset, and the loop in red mode will give us our ADSR, the sustain on that segment. If we just patch into segment 3, there's our ADSR. Now here's our delayed ADSR. Notice the gate comes on, it doesn't start straight away. That's set by this knob. But we actually get a rest or initial level for that delay as well. So let's set a little bit of delay time. So we can add a delay with an initial value as well. Now we can do, if we keep expanding this to all 6 stages, a delayed attack, hold, decay, sustain, release. So again, release, going backwards because we're working right to left, release, sustain, decay. I now want a hold. I want this to be an attack, and I want this to be a delay. So before we do that, actually, let's just go from this section. Attack, hold, decay, sustain, release. So that's our attack, hold time, on the pot, level. And that hold stage sets the peak of the envelope. It's going to rise to it, decay from it to the sustain, which actually creates a unique effect of if the hold is less than the sustain level, it's attacking to a low value, then coming up and decaying to this. So it's not really a decay, it turns this into a rise. So of course we've hold higher, as you'd expect, attacking to a peak. Let's gate this from the first segment, which is a red held mode, so that's going to give us a delay, long delay time. Let's shorten that. And the initial onset while that first stage is serving as a delay. And all gate dependent because of this looping red sustain stage. If I turn that off loop, we could just trigger this and it wouldn't take into account the gate length. So just to recap there, we have a delay with an initial level, attack or rise, hold, which is the peak of our envelope, that's the time it will hold, a decay, shape for the decay, sustain, level, triggered, not looping, so it doesn't take into account the gate, the time it will hold because it's not gate dependent, and a release and its shape. Again, if we add that sustain stage, this is now dependent on the gate, which you can see on this LED cable. We could go for some more, I guess, original and unique envelopes and actually make this a hold and that a sustain. At which point we have a delay, an attack, a sustain, a decay to a held release point that has its own time and level control, not gate dependent, and a release. So although this hold stage now is gate dependent, segment 3, because it's red and looping, this won't be. So you see that back end of the envelope, regardless of the gate length, will play anyway. If I hold the gate, this will sustain with gate, then let go. So by adding a hold stage, the red mode for a segment, at the end of an envelope, we can get not only a non-zero resting level for our envelopes, but also an end of cycle trigger. So here I have rise, fall or attack, decay, sustain. This is looping, so it's dependent on the gate input. Again, you'll see that cable light up to show gate length, and a release. Now with this as the red held mode and the level down, this will work like a normal ADSR. And my output is blue on Mordax data and modulating the level and some modulation on plats. But we can turn this level up. Kind of offsets the envelope enough when it's up high that we don't really get the action from the envelope. But notice we still get these outputs from each segment, it's just they're chained to the one that has the gate in. So segment 2 is our output for the whole thing, but we do still get outputs, and we can use this 6th segment that's creating our rest level and a non-zero rest level if we want, as I've just shown. We can use this to trigger other sounds, and a little bit of feedback patching works really nicely here. So I'm going to trigger the first segment, which is just a single, this will just be a single decay. It's set to ramp in its green mode. I'm going to patch that into the Mordax data. It will be the yellow trace at the bottom. Turn up the time of that decay. and see when this ends, fires off this first stage. So let's patch in a sound. That was a little cymbal noise you heard there. I'm going to set this to a 0 rest level again. And when my release is done, I'm going to let go of the gate. Sustain will go to release. When release is finished, it will fire off that first segment and we'll get this extra sound coming through the rest of my patch. So that's how to add a non-zero rest level to an ADSR, and also a little bit of feedback patching and an end of trigger out to trigger another sound at the end of that cycle. So when you patch a gate signal into an element, again working right to left, but here I've done it over every single segment, they become individual ramp generators, that green mode being the ramp generator. And these will just be decay envelopes. So I have 6 outputs on stages, taking rhythms from clock dividers and various little sequencers. I have my 6 outputs going into a 6-channel VCA, and then my mixer. And these are simply controlling the decay level of these VCAs, opening and closing the VCAs, letting sounds through for 6 decay envelopes. Make sure you're listening stereo again. I'll just close the decays down rather than mute the channels and show you each of those sounds. We've got this nice polymetric thing going on with these 6 decays, letting 6 sounds through a VCA and through my mixer. But patching feedback is great with stages. So let's take this 6th output, which is this one, and influence the time of the first segment, this noise, with this envelope. So it's way more interactive. Let's try the 3rd and the 6th. So feedback patching can warrant some great results, and not just when we're using each segment as an individual decay stage by itself. So continuing to look at single segment ramps, decay envelopes, let's look at some drum synthesis. Now for a lot of drum sounds, we need a simple tone, such as a sine wave. We need to be able to control its volume through a VCA. We may want to frequency modulate that tone. And there may be a noise element that again needs some control over its amplitude through a VCA. So this first channel controls the VCA with just a basic tone coming through. If I pull this out and just let my VCA drone, you can hear that's just a sine wave. So let's play with this envelope. First output here, segment 4 is the top, segment 5, blue on the data, segment 6, the bottom, yellow. Now the great thing with stages is each stage, when they're used as a ramp, has a shape control. So it may be that I want more of a logarithmic amplitude envelope, but then I want to frequency modulate my source with a different envelope. Let's make this linear. And I'm going to tune down and play with the FM depth on my oscillating filter, which is what you're listening to create a kick-like sound. So using two of those envelopes, there's a kick. Now if I just mute this on my mixer, I have a noise source going through a VCA. And I just want to create a little transient click of noise to give that kick a bit more punch. So let's unmute the kick again. So that's giving my kick a little click without it. So that's just a quick way of looking at the different segment generators for drum and percussion synthesis. So let's take a look at single segment looping ramps or looping envelopes or LFOs. Now, unlike a analog LFO, we're not going to get a bipolar response. This is still the 0 to 8 volt response we get from the stages, whether they're looping or not. Now I have a gate in segment 2 to cancel out segment 1 being potentially linked to anything else. And in the green mode, the ramp mode, hold, and this loops. The slider is the rate. And that's just modulating Platts. I'm just going to take my sequence out of Platts for a second. Now, the shape control, when this is non-looping, is now a shape control that actually cross-fades between different waveforms that are more useful as LFOs. We start with a falling ramp or falling saw, fade across to a sine-like wave, then to a square. We're going to stick with the sine-like modulation shape up top. Now we can influence this rate with CV. We can also add a clock to the gate input, and this will then act as a divider or a multiplier, going from ×4 down to divide by 4 of the clock speed. So let's pull back our sequence. I'm going to add a quarter note clock in terms of how fast Platts has been sequenced. So by going to ×4 of this clock, you can hear it's perfectly in sync by clocking the gate input. Let's go down to divide 4. And again, you can hear it's in time. So that's a simple single segment LFO or looping envelope. Now to get multi-stage loops, all we do is set 2 stages or more, and we press the first and the last one, and that will loop. So if I move my gate over to the 3rd segment, I'm going to take this out of the loop mode, hold both, and you can see that ping pong between the two sets our loop point. And you need to have this cable plugged in, whether it's just a dummy cable just floating around or patched into something. We now have a rise time with our shape. Again, let's just unplug the sequence. Our fall time. because it's that gate that links the two stages that's needed in order to make these LEDs ping pong and show that we have a two-stage looping. Let's make them both linear. And of course, with control over the time of both stages, we can create this triangle-like wave, a falling-like ramp, or rising ramp, and anything in between. Playing with their shapes, gives us a different response. Now if we wanted a longer looping pattern, let's gate segment 4, so these first 3 are now linked. Hold the first and last section to loop. I'm going to put this into the pitch of my oscillator. We now have an AR envelope, or a looping AR with a hold stage. Again, this cable's not plugged in, I'm not actually gating the start of the envelope. This is the level, this is the onset or the rise, and this is the fall. This is the time of that hold. And with this setup, because we can CV these, we could actually CV the level of our now attack, hold, rise looping envelope. So continuing to look at multi-stage or multi-segment looping envelopes, we can create a trapezoid LFO that has a minimum and a maximum level, as well as a rise and a fall, which is set by segments 1 and 3. So we need 4 segments for this. So let's pull out my patch here. I'm going to work backwards and plug a dummy cable in. Come out of segment 3. We want our rise, our peak, our hold, our release, and our what we release to, our kind of rest level that will recycle through. So to make this multi-stage loop again, we hold the first and last stage we want to loop. This will then ping pong through. We want these to be hold. So we have our attack time, the peak of the envelope, and its hold time. The decay, and the level it decays to, and the time before it recycles round. Now without the gate, we lose the linking of the channels, so we do need this dummy cable plugged in, but it goes back to the settings. Let's have a hold. Let's get this into the level of my oscillator instead of pitch. We can play with the shape and the attack and release in that, as well as the hold level or the peak level and its time. So that's how we would create a trapezoid LFO. So we've already seen that an isolated green step, the ramp mode, will give us either a decay envelope, or we can make that segment loop and create LFOs. Now, working right to left, I've isolated the first segment by patching a gate into 2, which is going to link 2 through 6, and then we've just got the single segment, segment 1, working on its own. And in the orange mode, the step mode, we can create sample and hold. Now I'm going to pull everything out and explain what's happening. So first I have a clock source, and that's triggering my oscillator, which you can just hear pulsing in the background. That's also this trace coming in to the yellow trace on data, channel 4. Because I'm patching in and out of data, I'm going to split this into the gate input on my first segment. I have a looping envelope going in first into data, that's this triangle wave at the top. And then I'm going to patch out of that into the CV input of stages. And then going to patch out of stages into the scope and then over to modulate my oscillator. Now this works because with each gate, this orange mode is just a step, it just holds its value. So if we're adding CV to that, that's what's going to then be sampled. So if I change the speed at which I'm triggering my oscillator and sampling this modulation, we can see these steps, the sample and hold, sampling this input, which is the CV input, at the rate set by the gate input, which is also what I'm triggering my oscillator with. Now the top little potentiometer will give us glide or slew. Smoothing out those hard edges on the sample and hold. Let's slow down my sampling clock. Speed that back up. I'm going to change my incoming CV signal, which is this top trace. Change this to a ramp LFO. Let's slow it down as well. Slow down my sampling clock. Instead of an LFO, when I pull the cable, this offset value will just be what's being sampled. Let's patch in some noise. And we're just getting the typical random LFO sample and hold style modulation because of these random fluctuations in my analog noise source. So we've just had a quick look at that orange segment as a single segment sample and hold, but we can use that to create a sequencer, as the orange mode is just a step. I've got a more interesting gate pattern than a steady clock, but this could just be a steady clock. Each gate now is going to work across its linked channels. Again, working right to left, we can use these for something else. And these are just going to output their value. My gate pattern is the yellow trace on data, the output of stage is the blue trace. If I wanted a larger sequence, let's just add a fourth stage. Out of segment 3. And as you heard there, we got some glide. These shape controls at the top will control glide from a hard step to a long slewed glide over the steps. Now let's patch the slightly more interesting rhythm in rather than a steady clock. Now as this is controlling pitch, let's get it through a quantizer. So I'm going to patch first into an attenuator just to control the range. I don't want 8 octaves of sequencing, which the 0 to 8 volt outputs there will give me. So I'm going into an attenuator, then into a quantizer. I'm going to turn off the glide and back into my oscillator. Let's extend this again to on a 5-stage sequence. Make this orange. If we add some slide. That glide, now it's going through a quantizer, is like sliding up and down the fretboard of a fretted instrument, like a guitar or a bass, but we don't get a smooth glide like you would on a violin, or pitch bending a string. It's sliding through the available notes on the quantizer. And again, just because why not, let's add a 6th stage. And because we can CV these stages, they're actually CVable steps. Let's try another sequence just to this step. So using that orange mode, we can really easily patch up a sequencer with individual glide time, step values, and just step through the linked segments, as well as CVing individual segments. We could break that by putting in another gate. Let's just patch this into its own clock. Now we've got 2 3-stage sequencers, or a 4 and a 2. So here I'm using 4 of the orange stages, segments 3 through 6, as a sequential switch. Now I'll just pull out my CVs here. And this is much like the sequence. 4 orange modes, 2 green, unused. It's working as a sequencer. The orange mode being a step that holds. This is just a steady gate, triggering through them. But we can CV their inputs. And this then works like an input for a sequential switch. So if I take this out of the data, and this is going to modulate my oscillator's volume and some tonal parameters, that's the first input I'm going to put into segment 3. So when it gets to that, and just patch stages back into the scope, that's what's going to appear. But just on that step, we could then sequence. So part sequencer, part sequential switch. Now I also have a slower free-running LFO. I'm going to plug that into the second stage. Plug stages back in. I have a final input, which is another looping envelope. Just been re-triggered by a sequencer. Now I'm going to put that into stage 4, And again, stages back into the scope and to the rest of my patch. Now we can offset these by these static values. Step 3 doesn't have an input, so this is like a sequencer. We can still add glide even though we're sequential switching. And it was the tuning I just knocked on my oscillator. So that's just a quick patch to show you how you can use the orange segments to create a sequential switch. And again, using this gate input, you could break this into as many stages as you want. If you wanted a free stage, you'd patch over. So let's take a look at using stages as a sequential switch again, but this time for audio. Now I've just seen it for passing through LFOs and modulation, which works great. We could also patch through various different rhythms on each stage and cycle through them. That works great. For audio, it's a little bit quirky because it doesn't quite pass through the audio exactly as it comes in. So let's take a listen to what we've got. And this is 3 audio sources coming into these stages. This is the first one, just on its own. Now you can hear that it was quite degraded in quality when it went through stages. My second is a noise source. Again, not quite passing through at its full quality. A bit crunchy and degraded. And my last one, a more basic saw wave. Again, more crunchy and degraded. But it can work great as a processor, so let's get some sequencing going into my oscillators. This is the same sequence, split 2 plats, and I've got a braids off screen and the noise in the middle. Again, this degraded quality. Let's add our sound into a VCA. Get some noise back in. Let's add a kick. So for some degraded, crunchy audio that's quite quirky, we can also use this sequential switch to pass through audio. So another interesting little feature is to use the red mode to actually pass through audio, like a hard gated VCA. Now I have an input patched to this slider level, the CV input, a gate into the gate input. I'm in the looping red mode, which is dependent on the gate length coming in. You might remember that from the looping red mode that we used for a sustain in the envelopes earlier in the video. And my output's going to the data and then coming into the mixer. So when I hold a gate, we get a hard on and off. Now it's clicky and we've got that quirky audio degradation that we had from the previous patch, but it's there. Now, if we wanted to rise into this, create a kind of attack into the sound, we'll leave our sound plugged in here. We're going to link the channels, gate in segment 5, and rise using the ramp. Change the shape. Now if you like that audio degradation, this is great as a sidechain device. Now I'm going to trigger a kick drum. I'm going to swap my gate source to be what's triggering my kick. And this is like the pump, the amount of sidechain on this kind of weird compressor, if you like. both the time to fade in and the shape. Now personally, if I'm doing this kind of sidechain against the kick thing, I like this to be tight exponential rise. And with that crunch and audio degradation, we can pretend that we're creating Satisfaction by Benny Benassi, if you want that hard sidechain pump. So in this patch, we're going to explore single segment red hold modes. Now I have a gate coming in, which is then coming out into data, that's the blue trace, and then going into stage 3 to trigger a 4-stage ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. Segment 1 is just a looping modulation, which is dealing with some tonal modulation on Platts, my droning oscillator. Now, with the red mode on its own and a gate signal coming in, the top little potentiometer is going to set the pulse duration, and this is going to set the peak of the pulse. So let's go up full. You can see this red signal on this LED cable, that's my incoming gate. And I'm going to turn up this little pot, which is going to be my pulse duration. Meaning we can convert longer gates to triggers or short triggers to longer gates. Now you can hear the sound cuts off before that gate. That's like a gate to trigger converter. It's now a longer gate. This pulse is now higher for longer than the actual gate coming in, so it's like a gate extender. It lengthens an incoming gate. Now let's show this as a short trigger. So this is a very short trigger coming in. This is extending it. Let's have a longer gate coming in and shorten it. Like a gate to trigger, which is really useful. Especially if you're working with things like low pass gates or filters, VCAs, where you want to emulate that kind of strike input on something and you need a short trigger just to ping or pluck or strike something around a patch. So if we make this loop and take our gate signal out, but put our gate signal into the CV, this will actually work as a delay. Which again, really cool, handy feature. And I love that Stages is all about the patching, much like an old dual slope generator from Surge. That could be a filter, an envelope, an LFO, an oscillator, a slew. It's all in the patching. There's no menus, no screen, nothing to really remember. Just learn about what these segments do from these various examples and you're off. So this is triggering pretty much in time with this hi-hat that I've got patched up. Now let's add some delay to offset this timing. Another really handy feature, and this is because the segment is behaving like a CV delay. The voltage set by the slider and the CV input is what's sent to the output with the delay set by the potentiometer. And this is when it's a single segment on its own and the red mode is looping. So in this final patch, we're going to look at breakpoints within our envelopes. Now, if I was to patch out of stage 3, I would have an attack, decay, sustain, release, because we've got the green ramp. your looping red mode, which is gate length dependent, and a release. It's holding while I hold the gate. You can see the gate on the red cable, red LED on the cable, and a release. Now if I patch over to stage 2, segment 2, we've now got a 5-stage envelope, and this will be an attack, decay 1, decay 2, sustain, release. Now the breakpoint is between the apex and the sustain, the peak and the sustain of the envelope, and the potentiometer of the second segment will control the voltage at this breakpoint. So if I just play a gate now, listen to our sound, watch the envelope on data. I'm just going to wait for that trace on data to get back to the beginning. Now you can see it rose, decayed slowly, decayed quickly, which is this 3rd stage, sustained and released. Let's do that again. Now let's set the voltage to be a little bit higher on that 2nd segment. We'll again wait for the trace. So you can see it wasn't a hold, it did decay. Let's make slightly quicker decay times for both. Let's have a faster decay and a longer decay. Gonna get that breakpoint a little bit lower, slightly longer decay there. Increase this decay time, make it a bit easier to see and hear. So you can see that 1 decay, 2 decay, then the sustain. Decaying down to my sustain after a quick decay. Now we could do that over 6 stages and create a breakpoint in the release. So I will change that to a normal segment. Put my red looping stage on segment 4. Attack, decay 1, decay 2, sustain, release 1, release 2. I'm just going to pump up the time on data. And let's check this out. Now we're getting a decay and then a rise because the voltage is set so low on this decay for its breakpoint. If this was higher, we can hear that breakpoint in the release as well. So that's it for this video on stages. There is the index that I mentioned in the video description. Be sure to go through, click on the various examples. And as I said, I love that stages is very simple in presentation, very quick to get going, but there's some amazingly complex and widely ranged features that any of these segments can do by chaining them together, working right to left, or using them as individual segments or groups of 2s or 3s, from sample and hold to sequencing, LFOs, envelopes, be those gated or triggered, sequential switching, some cool little audio tricks. There's a lot to be had from stages. It's about learning what those segments do and then trying that and applying those in your patches. Hope this video has been useful. Feel free to leave any feedback or comments in the video description. I will reply to all of them. Huge thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. If you want to support a little bit more, go over to my Patreon page and consider supporting there for the bonuses and exclusive content that people get over there. Cheers.